Okay. So I'm Elizabeth Bogle. I'm a secondary English education major. I am a senior, and I'm from Fort Wayne, Indiana.
I'm Cassidy Esch. I'm an elementary education major. I'm a freshman and I'm from Lagodi, Indiana.
Okay, thank you for joining me. I definitely want to ask, like, first off, like to set a baseline, how did you end up in Honors 199?
So I was scheduling my classes over the summer with my advisor, and she was just telling me, listing all the options that I had to take this year. And like for every single option I had, she was like, "Do you want to take this or this?" And then the concept of what am I trying to say? The description of the class that she gave me sounded really interesting, and it was very relevant to obviously what all had been going on over the summer that I had been really interested in being an activist about and everything. And that sounded, I was like, oh, that's really relevant to my life. I feel like I need to take that.
Um, so that kind of answers like what drew you to it, but what did you expect from it?
Um, I honestly don't really know what I expected because I had never taken a college class before whenever I scheduled it. I thought it was definitely going to be something that I would be genuinely interested in the source material because I love learning new things if it's something that I'm interested about. Like math doesn't interest me that much, so I'm not going to be like excited to read about that kind of thing. But this is like something that I've always been really interested in and that has been really, really important. And I realized that it was important. And so I don't know what I expected, but I know that I was kind of, I don't want to say excited because you're not excited to talk about racism. You're not, but like I was interested to learn more because I had never really gotten to learn that much about race and racism in high school.
Yeah, you talk about like not really getting the chance to learn. What was it like for you, like growing up, going to high school? Like, what was the experience like in your hometown and like in those classes that you had?
So my hometown is the population is about 2,000, I think. My graduating class was 68. And so like really small, really white. Like I think that there was two people of color in my graduating class. And when I was growing up, there was like two in my elementary class. So I never really got to speak all that much with people of color and learn about their experiences. But I guess whenever I was like little, I could see that their skin was different, but I never really cared. Like I was a kid. I didn't care. I didn't realize that that made any difference. And so I didn't realize that that could make any difference in how they were treated. I didn't understand why people would care about that. And as I was growing up and I started to learn about slavery and the civil rights movement, I was like, oh, wow, that's a big problem. But, you know, in elementary school, I don't know if your education was this way, but we kind of learned in like, I don't know, fourth, fifth, and sixth grade that like after Martin Luther King Jr. gave the I Have a Dream speech, racism disappeared. Like, that's not explicitly what they said, but, you know, I felt like that was what was implied. I was like, well, thank goodness we don't have to worry about that anymore. But obviously that's not the case. But I guess what I'm trying to say is growing up, we just didn't talk about race unless it was in terms of like history, because I just learned, oh, that's a thing of the past. It's not here anymore.
Yeah, so obviously you said your elementary education. Um, so like in schools, there's a tendency to like focus on like one specific like aspect of race. Like I think in grade schools, like one thing that you get a lot is like, oh, George Washington Carver invented peanut butter, and that's like one Black person that you hear anything about. Like you don't hear about any kind of advancements from others. How do you think that you, as a teacher, would have addressed that differently?
So I think that I, part of being an elementary education major for me is that I love looking at all this. It sounds dumb, but looking at all like the classroom decorations and everything, and like all these things that the way that teachers decorate their classrooms. And then I came across like this Pinterest board for like Black History Month. And so it was like they had a different Black person that has influenced or that is like an academic or an inventor every single day of Black History Month. So there was 28 of them. And so every day the teacher would take 10, 20 minutes to talk about that person. And I think that that's definitely something I'm going to be taking with me into the classroom. And I was like, wow, that is so cool, because same as you, I learned about George Washington Carver and I learned about Harriet Tubman and MLK, and that was about it. So I would definitely speak about like how there's so many Black academic scholars that we don't learn about.
Yeah. I like the way that you would address race. But like,
Sorry. Yeah, it's fine.
I like the way you talk about like how you would address race. But like, how was that like growing up? Like, obviously you said there were only about 2 people of color, but like, what kind of conversations were there? Like, either like from teachers or like with your peers?
Honestly, I think it was more of a lack thereof. We just didn't really talk about it. And when someone like started to bring it up, they were like, oh, change the subject. We don't need to talk about that. We don't need to talk about that. And I whenever I was in 3rd grade, my teacher, my 3rd grade teacher, we were learning about the Underground Railroad and everything. And so we did our own little project that was the Underground Railroad, where we had to like hide in different classrooms and like run really fast and find refuge in different classrooms, which I was like, I get they were trying to like show us what it was like for them, but you're not really going to be able to show us what it was like for slaves trying to escape. So I was like, I don't know if that was helpful or really problematic. I don't know, but that was one of the first experiences I had with it.
So do you think growing up you had like less exposure to anything that we talked about in this class than most people?
I would say definitely. And I know that a lot of people in the class when we first started were like, there's not a lot of Black people in my town, so I don't have experience with this. And I don't want to be like one of those people, because I don't know. I don't want to say that I don't have accountability to know what I'm talking about or to educate myself about race just because I didn't grow up with a lot of people of color where I live. But I just, until I was old enough to go off and do research on my own, I really, nobody talked to me about that kind of stuff unless it was in the context of history class.
Yeah, so you talk about like your own accountability. Obviously this class is about accountability and like trying to address issues. How do you see yourself fitting into like either the harmful system or a system that's trying to like address itself?
So I would say, what do you mean by system?
So like obviously like there's systemic racism, and obviously there like as white people like there's going to be like this idea of like contributing to it by not saying anything, but like there's also like the side of history that's trying to address it. So I guess that's not really a system, but like how do you see yourself fitting in either one?
Okay, I get what you mean now. So let's see. I guess whenever I was in 7th grade, I was just starting to kind of like realize what politics were and that I was really interested in them. But unfortunately, I found myself on like the wrong side of the internet, and I was like a Republican for a couple years. And so, because I had never been exposed to anything else, and like I'd never talked to my parents about politics, but most of the people around me that I'd ever heard talk about it were on that side of the spectrum, because, you know, we live in Southern Indiana, kind of like the middle of nowhere. But I think that what you mean by fitting into that system is that after a while, I like went off and actually did my own research rather than just like listening to what different people said. And I realized that, oh my gosh, there's a huge problem. And so I guess going into now, what side of the system I fit on is like trying to educate the people around me, like, I guess in a nice way, because my brother's going through that phase right now where he's like a Ben Shapiro kid and doesn't want to hear anything. And so like a lot of what I heard about, like when I was doing research after George Floyd was murdered, what can what can white people do to help? Like, there's no protests in my area. There's 2,000 people in my city, and almost all of them are white. And so I was like, what the heck am I going to do? You know, I felt useless. And so one of the biggest things was educate whether it's your parents, your siblings, your family around you that doesn't really understand what the problem is, like, to help educate them. So I guess that's kind of how I would help this system.
Do you think that, like, I mean, obviously you're a freshman, but do you think that, like, Ball State has equipped you to do that any better?
I think this class in particular has, but I don't know I guess I haven't been at the university long enough to know how they would help me do that kind of thing. But with putting me in this class and having this class be required for the honors college, that has definitely helped a lot. I've learned like so much in this class.
Yeah, Ball State is like historically and predominantly white. So that's like a big issue. But have you like seen any kind of like diversity? Have you seen any kind of like actual welcoming here, or is it completely different starting college like in the wake of a global pandemic?
When it comes to like welcoming, I guess there was like, I don't know, move-in day whenever they were like, we're so happy to have you here and that kind of stuff. But there's also just been less activities that have been able to happen, obviously, since it's 2020. So like there hasn't been as much, you know, things that we're able to do when it comes to welcoming or anything else. But I do remember I think it was still in September, like, so maybe the second or third week I got here, there was a Black Lives Matter protest by the bell tower, and that was the first protest that I had ever gone to. But I guess that wasn't even organized by the university, but it was part of the thing that I got when I came here. It was like, okay, this is different. This is not the same as I've always had, and that's good. And so that was really interesting to go to. There was like a lot of people speaking, and it was really interesting to hear their perspectives because I had genuinely never been able to hear in person the account of people of color and what they go through on a day-to-day basis. So I guess that was part of it. But when it comes to actually the university, like the university welcoming and including people, I haven't really had a lot of that.
Yeah. And I guess it is hard navigating a university as a first semester freshman during a pandemic. And you've talked about like your experience with not being able to protest and your own research, but like how has like 2020 and how have these events like actually shaped you? How have you seen yourself changed after like the killing of George Floyd, after attending the Ball State protest, etc.?
I think that the experience before George Floyd was murdered, the experience that I had with the Black Lives Matter movement was not a lot. Like, I had heard about it on the internet and I was like, oh, that's a big city thing. Like, I glossed over it because I was like, that's not something that involves me because I don't live in a big city, or I don't know people of color, so it doesn't involve me. And that was really ignorant to think. And so I guess whenever that happened in June, it was just kind of a wake-up call for me. I was like, no, this is your problem. It's everyone's problem. And so I guess I needed to learn that, and I should have learned it a lot earlier on. But I'm glad that I did learn it and realize that this is a much bigger problem than people make it out to be, and that it needs to be fixed, obviously. But like, I guess it was just learning that there's more to life than just my little town and what happens here. There's things that go on in other places that are also my responsibility to think about.
Has this class, especially like this semester being like when it is, has it helped you grow in your knowledge and grow in your own activism?
Yeah, it definitely has taught me about things that I had never really thought about before. I think I knew what microaggressions were, but I had never like learned in detail why there's such a bad thing and what, like, how to avoid spreading microaggressions. So like that in particular, and just all the things that I never would have realized that I learned about, that I was like so glad to learn about, because as I said, I'm really interested in this and making a difference and that kind of thing. So I guess I would say just learning new things has been the biggest part of it.
Of those new things you've learned, like what are you going to take with you? How is that going to shape your future?
So especially from the books we read, I think it's just hearing more stories from people of color that I never got to hear before. And I think what I can take with me in the future is new perspectives, because, you know, the more people you meet and the more things, especially, you know, you read these stories about the things that people went through, obviously that opens you up to new perspectives. And I think that there's something to be said for how much knowledge you can get from reading books and just academics and that kind of thing. You can become an extremely smart person, but if you don't speak to other people and open yourself up and hear other perspectives, you're missing out on a whole chunk of things that you could learn just from understanding how other people grew up besides just you. You know, you can do so much more than just reading a book. And I think that that's really important. And that's something that I didn't realize as much as I do now. So I think that I guess I would take with me other people's life experiences that they've shared and understand that there's more than just my perspective. And so I guess, like, I don't know, whenever I'm speaking to my students in the future, like, understand that they have a different life experience than me and that they have different perspectives.
You talk about like these different perspectives, especially the ones that you heard in the class that were able to broaden your own horizons. Can you talk a little bit about like which like readings or like which students, not like by name or anything, but like who changed that for you? Like who was able to give you this perspective?
So part of it was definitely the Cassidy Anti-Racism book, because in that book he tells a lot of stories about how he grew up. And so it was kind of that, but also since it's a discussion class, like the accounts that other students have had and just the things that they shared and talked about were also really interesting to me, and how I got to hear the way that they grew up that might have been a lot different from me. Like I grew up Catholic, but you said that you went to Catholic school, right? Yeah. So like that was something different that I had never experienced before. And so it was kind of just not only hearing stories from like the readings that we had, but also hearing students talk during discussion.
Um, from like everything in the course and what you've heard from other students, how do you think like this semester you would define an anti-racist?
I think that I would define an anti-racist as someone who understands that racism is here and it's not going to go away without a fight. So you know how some people still, like, I grew up learning that that racism went away after Martin Luther King gave that speech. So obviously that's not the case. So I think that to be an anti-racist, first you have to understand that racism is here, and you have to understand that, because you can't go from there if you don't get that it hasn't gone away. And then I guess something else would be you have to participate in activism one way or another, whether that's like educating the people around you, like I said before, or going to protests, or donating to funds that help people going through this kind of stuff, or writing to your senators or your representatives, which is something that I've done a little bit over the summer, because I was like, well, if nothing else, I can write to these people, even though my representative and both of my senators are all Republicans. But I'm like, maybe if they get enough public pressure, they're going to do something, because that was one way I thought that I could help, was writing to those people and trying to like make my voice heard, because I feel like they weren't getting enough pressure from the public. And of course, I just got those canned, like, thank you for your thank you for your time. Thank you for writing. Like the generic stuff where they're like, yeah, we're not going to change what we do because we're not going to get elected if we do anything about what you just said. So it was just kind of getting that back that was like frustrating. But I think when it comes to being an anti-racist, you have to keep pursuing. You can't give up whenever this person like blows you off, like doesn't care about what you have to say. That cannot be the end of it. You have to keep you have to not give up because you're trying to be a voice for these people who've been ignored for so long.
Being in like a red state, and especially being from like a small town, do you think that there's something to be said about like there just being a lack of anti-racism training that leads to more of these racist activities?
Yeah, I would definitely say that because I guess where I'm from, it's not really like the deep South where there can be a lot of like KKK activity and all like really, really bad stuff. But it's more of a culture of, since that stuff isn't around us, people just think that it doesn't exist. And so I guess it's more of a culture of ignoring and pretending it's not there, or maybe not even knowing it's there, rather than blatantly contributing to it. And I guess by ignoring it, you are contributing to it, if that makes sense. So when there's also like a certain amount of microaggressions that can happen here because they don't realize they're saying anything wrong. So I think that there definitely needs to be more like anti-racist classes taught in school, or just taught within other classes. It doesn't even have to be a dedicated course, just something to get people understanding that the things that they say and do have consequences when it comes to that.
Yeah, you've talked about courses, but like how do you think like you or I or anyone in this class or even anyone in this state or university, like how do you think that they can address, like in their own small towns and like these red states, how do you think that they can address anti-racism in a way that they'll be accepted?
I don't know about the way that they'll be accepted part, because it's really hard to say something that most of the people in your town have never thought about or have never considered, and they're just going to listen with open ears. Some people listen with open ears, but a lot of people are really closed-minded and don't like to listen to things because they've never thought about it in their life. So surely it must not be a problem. And so I think that there's like, I guess you could write to the mayor. That would be one thing that you could do. And another thing is just like, I don't know about you, but in our town, like Facebook is a really big thing. Everybody's friends with everybody on Facebook. And so like sharing articles on Facebook that could maybe help educate people, because people are nosy. They're going to read what you share. They're going to be like, oh, what's this? That she thinks she's so smart, but maybe they actually might learn something if they read something that you shared on there. So it's just, I guess, going at it by a more educational angle might help, rather than just being like, here's why I think you're wrong, because that's something that a lot of people have talked about, going at it like gently, I guess, which if you're a racist, you don't deserve someone being gentle to you. But it's not even just racist people, just people that don't understand what people of color go through in this country because they've never interacted with that kind of thing. So I would say it's just going at it from an angle that's more educational, and then when they learn something along the way, they learn to be more of an activist.
Not to keep hammering home this education perspective, I think it's something that I naturally do, as we're both like educators, youth educators. But like for like people like your brother, or like you when you were like in a Republican phase, like how do you think you can navigate like the dichotomy between like an anti-racist and a Ben Shapiro kid?
So I think that it's kind of what I was saying at the last question too, just education, just learning and understanding, because I think that a lot of the beliefs I used to have were because of a lack of understanding. Like, for example, whenever the Black Lives Matter movement was first kind of coming up in like 2015, and that year, that was my 8th grade year, my 7th and 8th grade year. I was kind of like, oh, yeah, that's really bad, but it's just one bad apple. Obviously, not every cop is like that. And so I think it was just a lack of understanding that they cover up for each other, or there's this culture of not accountability in the police system where they will not rat out their fellow cops. They will not tell someone whenever they're doing something wrong. They won't stand up for what's right because of that culture of they have to protect each other. And so that was something that I just didn't understand. And so I think that it's just learning. It's getting that education like hammered into your head, other people's perspectives, what goes on in the world that you don't know about. Because I think that a lot of hate just comes from ignorance. And so I think that if we were educated from a much younger age, like I was saying before, or once we learn to educate ourselves, we go in the right direction rather than the wrong direction, that would help us understand a lot more what other people go through and other people's perspectives.
Do you think that ignorance can be classified with complicity in this system, or do you think that there's like a little bit more nuance? Like there's something that's not just like ignorance?
I think that that's a really good question. I guess it all depends on, I guess, how old you are or who you've spoken to in your life, or if, I mean, everyone has access to the internet. So I guess like you could say if you have access to the internet, you have access to Google, then you have no excuse to be ignorant about these things. And that is a very fair point, you know, but it's also like if you're a young kid and you haven't really dealt with that kind of thing before, you're like, whoa, you have so many options. What the heck do I click on? You know, um, so I guess it's a kind of thing where you could say that everyone who has access to Google doesn't have an excuse to be ignorant. But there's also like a culture of ignorance of like, well, I don't have privilege because I'm poor. Like, I guess there's a lot of parents who will teach their children that uh that, hey, listen here, kid, like we don't have privilege, look at us, we live in a trailer, which is really upsetting. Like no one should have to live that way. That's not good, but that doesn't mean that you don't have a certain amount of privilege compared to a person of color. So I think it's just like, it's not only the internet that they use for education, but it's also the people around you, that your parents and your grandparents and your aunts and uncles are going to shape how you view the world, because they are the only people that you look to when you're young. So I guess when it comes to that, I would say that in a weird way, ignorance can be taught, if that makes any sense. Like it can be taught to not look into things further, because if I don't know about it, then it must not be a thing. It must not be the truth. So I think that you should grow up and learn to go do your own research and try to see things from other people's perspective.
Yeah, thinking about like the future, and especially like as someone who wants to be an educator, like you've talked about like definitely things that would be good, like the uh, Black History Month board. How do you think you can like unteach like that ignorance? How do you think not just you, but like anyone can go into the future and change like that ignorance, that like willful like bliss of not knowing?
I think it's really, really hard to unteach something. I think that growing someone's knowledge doesn't really come from like, I guess it comes from unteaching, but whenever you surround them with knowledge that doesn't necessarily contradict what they've learned in the past, but it adds on to it, being like, hey, I know that you've never seen a Black person, you know, have these things happen to them, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't happen. So like sort of adding on to what they already know, and it kind of like whenever you give them all this new information, it kind of surrounds the old stuff that they learned from their parents or whoever taught them, and it kind of just surrounds it and makes it irrelevant. Because yeah, my grandpa told me that I don't have privilege, but if you surround them with information that proves otherwise, it can kind of nullify that, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Do you think like we have the grounds right now to be able to address and try to eliminate these failings? Um, or do you think that there still needs to be more work done, like in like our education of anti-racism in our own country's portrayal of it?
I do think that there needs to be more work done before we can make a huge systemic change in the education system, because a lot of the teachers that are teaching right now went to college in the 70s or 80s. And so if you try to hand them a book that's like, hey, you have to teach this now, and it's anti-racism, and they're like, what the heck is this? I've never seen this in my life. Like, I think you have to start from educate from when they're getting their education degree. And I think that there should be a flat thing right there. When you're getting your education degree, you should have to learn about anti-racism in college, because they're a teacher that went to college in the 80s and never learned about anti-racism is not going to be able to teach it now, because they never really learned about it that much. And so obviously they're going to be like, well, I can't teach this. I don't know anything about it. So I think it's going to take a very long time to get that going and to get the ball rolling on that. And I think that something that would maybe help would be like, teachers have to take a certain amount of training every year. I think that that's the way it is in Indiana. I'm assuming it's that way in other states. They have to take a certain amount of training every year to like keep their knowledge up. And I think that anti-racism is a really good thing that could be added to that, to where they have to introduce it each year so that they can learn about it and then slowly add it to their curriculum.
Do you think in the next 5 to 10 years we'll see any kind of change in that system?
I think in the next 5 years, probably not, unfortunately, because there's still half the country that thinks that white privilege isn't a thing and that it doesn't exist. And fundamentally, if you don't understand that white privilege exists, you're not going to be able to break it down and try and get rid of it. You're not going to be able to lift people of color up enough to get rid of that privilege if half the country doesn't believe it's there. And that's just part of it. And so, and I mean, I don't really know about 10 years either. I'm not very good at predicting the future, but I would just say maybe we'll get closer by then, I hope. But honestly, I don't really know, because it seems like in the past 20 to 40 years, like the conservative party has just moved so much further to the right. And I think so has the Democratic Party, like when it comes to the establishment, not necessarily like really progressive people, but when it comes to the establishment, they have moved further to the right too, because they want to compromise with like, Iowa voters. They want to get those votes. Like, so I think it's just a matter of, I guess, changing the culture, which is really hard to do. That's not something that happens lightly. So I don't know that they'll be changed in the next 5 to 10 years. I have hope for the future, but it's hard to have hope whenever throughout your life you've seen things get worse for people of color. If that makes sense.
Yeah. Where do you see yourself like fitting into that scheme, and where do you see yourself like actually addressing anti-racism in the next 5 to 10 years?
So I'm hoping that since I go to college, obviously right now I'm not in Muncie, but since I go to college in a bigger city, and since I'm hoping to get to travel or maybe move somewhere bigger throughout the years, that I will be able to go to as many protests as possible, which is something that I haven't been able to really do a lot, as well as like, I mean, I'll be teaching within the next 10 years. So obviously teaching that to my students and making sure that they understand that, I guess, as much as you can tell an elementary schooler that white privilege is real, you can't really tell that to an elementary schooler, but that they understand that there's different perspectives rather than just their own. So I guess I would say taking it into the classroom as well as being more of an activist myself.
Is there anything from this class specifically that you'll take in, or do you think like it's kind of like a mixed bag what's going to go in there?
I think it'll definitely be a mixed bag, because I'm sure there's a lot of things that I'm going to learn in the next 4 years that I don't know yet. I'm positive that there will be, but there's also a lot of things from this class that I will definitely take with me. A lot of these readings have been really influential, and I've just learned so many things that I've never realized before. My education on microaggressions, on white privilege is just like so much deeper now that I will definitely have to take that with me, and it will help me address those kinds of things in the workplace or just in my life or family life.
Yeah. Um, do you think, did this course like actively help you along your journey, or do you think like a lot of what you learned came from researching like the killings of George Floyd and like anything that happened over the summer?
I think definitely a lot of what I learned in this course will help me, because although I did research on my own, I couldn't have put together the list of scholarly articles or videos that Bartlett did for us, and that the SIAAC did. So I think that there is a lot of strength in those being provided to me all at once, and this huge list of things that I can look at to learn about anti-racism, rather than just me going off and Googling on my own. And so I think it's going to be a lot of things that I've learned in this class that are going to help me specifically, since I've had it all like listed and just like laid out for me easily.
Yeah. Do you have anything that like you want to add to this? Like anything you think I didn't cover? Because we still have a little bit of time.
Let me see. I guess one big thing that I was thinking about was, how do you bring the perspective of people of color to a town that's got barely any people? I guess not barely any people, but a small amount of people, and most all of them are white. And so I guess a good way to do that would be like, whenever you show movies in class, make sure to show movies that have, you know, characters that are Black or Asian or Latino, so that people understand that so that even little ones understand that there's perspectives that aren't just theirs, that there are lots of people in the world, and that they're not all white, and that so I guess it would be that kind of thing, because if kids grow up just surrounded by white kids, and then they just watch movies that just have white kids in them, they're not going to realize that there's a world outside of their own. So I think that that's, even if there's not that much diversity in your classroom, you can make it so that even if a kid isn't surrounded, even if a kid doesn't have people of color surrounding them, that they understand that there are, you know, different experiences in the world besides just their own.
Do you think, like you mentioned, you want to be able to show movies in class that like highlight everything? Do you think that, especially like for elementary education, do you think that there's really like good representation out there?
I don't think there's as much as there should be, because like, you know, growing up, Black kids always talk about how they didn't get to see themselves on screen much. I mean, my generation, like maybe a little bit, I can think of a lot of shows from when I was little that had representation of people of color, which is awesome that it's like gotten better, but I think we still have a ways to go. So like, I guess whenever I was younger, I watched like That's So Raven. I loved that show, and like Proud Family and The Princess and the Frog was like one of my favorite movies ever. I love that movie. So I guess I would just, not even just showing videos that or movies that teach about anti-racism, but just normalizing like Black people in the media, and just sharing their stories beyond just them fighting against racism, showing them living as, you know, regular people, because that's what they are, because their whole life isn't fighting against prejudice. They have lives of their own too. And I think that a lot of people don't see them that way because of the lack of representation in the media.
Yeah, I think my final question to you is essentially like, what does this all mean? Like, what does this mean? Like, anything from the course, anything from real life, like protesting, anything from these movies, like, what does it all boil down to? How can like anti-racism actually um, come up in your life? How can it affect like lawmakers? Like, how does this all matter?
I think that the biggest takeaway from it is it all goes back to treating people with dignity and respect. And if you do that from the get-go, everything else just falls into place. So if you think about how there's a history of cops treating Black people with complete disrespect, disregard for their lives, I think that if you just think about the ways that we could help people treat other people with dignity and respect, if that makes sense. So, like, whether that's police reform, increased training, racial bias training, all of that goes back to treating people like people. And if you do that from the get-go, and if you keep inclusivity in education, in all the other things that you grow up with, then it just kind of falls into place, if that makes sense, along with like treating people with dignity. Activism comes with that, because whenever you see people treated like they should not be treated, you want to do something about it, and that it's part of the respect thing. So I think that like it just goes back to standing up for what's right and treating people the way that they should be treated.
Oh, that was a great answer. Thank you so much for your time. I think both of us had a good, fruitful conversation. Have a great rest of your finals and a great rest of your day.
Thank you. You too.